Hello! Today I'm going to have a tutorial on how I made this first part of my undergraduate carbon nanotube animation. So here you'll see a very simplified explanation of what graphene is, just a large array of carbons in a very repetitive kind of pattern. So to break down how I created this animation overall, I'm going to have 4 different chapters. The first of which is going to be just this very simplified, like almost cartoonish carbon atom depiction with the 4 valence electrons at the outset, just rotating simply around the C. The second chapter is going to be making those valence electrons disappear and then simplifying the carbon, the C at the very center, to just a very basic sphere. The third chapter will be turning all of those different spheres of carbon into just a very basic hexane through a circular array. And then the final chapter will be to create a 2D array of just these different hexagonal shapes so that they overlap and create a repeating pattern. So let's open up a new project. And I'm actually going to delete the default cube today because I'm not doing geometry nodes. I don't need it. And I'm going to just insert text here and type out a C and change the font by going over to the properties page over here and navigating over to the specific font that I like. Alright, so I'm going to enlarge this a bit, and I'm gonna just rotate it so that it faces towards the y-axis when you're viewing it on this perspective. I'm gonna change that over to a mesh so that I can extrude it and do other edits later. And I'm going to apply all transforms, so if I need to do anything else with this C, nothing funky goes on. So here I'm in edit mode, and I'm just going to very simply extrude everything along the y-axis so that it gives some thickness to the C. I'm going to press A, select everything, and then make sure I center that. And that looks great. I'm going to add in an icosphere and subdivide it a couple of times so I get a smoother spherical shape instead of the more iconic D20-esque look. I'd suggest shading it smooth as well. I'm going to make a new collection, which is going to be where our electrons exist, and make sure to name the carbon appropriately, name everything as you go. I don't do that for the entire tutorial, which is not great practice, but you know, it's fine. So make sure to add in a curved circle and increase the scale a bit. So this is going to be our the circumference of our circle that the electrons are going to travel on. So I chose to angle this at 25 degrees, duplicate that, and adjust the angle so that it is also evenly at 25 degrees on the other side. And that looks pretty good. It's a very, you know, cartoony, simplistic depiction of a carbon atom, but that's the look we're going for. So add an object constraint on our first icosphere here and make it follow the path of one of those Bezier circles. Now after that, you can switch the position of that icosphere along the Bezier circle by changing the offset. I started off with 50, and you'll see that I change it later because it wasn't a very good look. And apply the exact same thing to the other 2 icospheres, but to the other Bezier circle. I'm very bad, and I did not label any of my things here. They're just the very basic icosphere 1, 2, 3, Bezier 1, 2. which is not great if you have a bunch of different objects that you're working with, but I guess in this case it's fine. Just practice what I preach, not what I'm doing right here. This is not the best. You know, you get it. Alright, so I changed the positions of the other two icospheres. Here I'm animating how it circles around the carbon. So go to the very first frame, add a keyframe off to the side, and then for the second frame at the very end of your animation, you're going to want to offset it as many times as you want it to circle around. And if you'll notice, it doesn't travel in a linear fashion. Like it starts off slow, then it speeds up, and then it slows down. So to change that, go over to the interpolation mode and change that to linear. And basically just repeat the process for every other icosphere as well. Now we're going to make it so that the large valence electrons disappear. So what we're going to do is just make a scale keyframe type. Go to that first frame. Then you go over to the very end, and you're going to want to shrink down the scale to a non-noticeable level like that. And instead of going to the other objects and repeating that exact process, I'm going to add an object constraint and make it copy the scale of the icosphere that we just changed. So it's basically just a copy and paste transform of scale to everything else. Very easy, very automated in that sense. And I think this looks pretty good. So after making sure that everything looks pretty decently, I'm going to set up the rest of the scene so that it's not just a carbon and valence electrons floating out in nowhere. There's going to be a space for everything to kind of exist in. So I want to give it the look that it's in a studio with studio lighting. So to do that, create a plane, extrude the edge, bevel out to that corner quite a bit, and smooth it out if you want. And I'm just going to expand that a lot so that it's just a very long, like, L shape. And here my plane is way too far away to the camera, so you can either adjust the camera settings, or you can just move over the plane so that the camera picks up the setting. I'm going to add in an HDRI, so I have my lighting. We'll move on to the next section, which is simplifying. I'm going to make the carbon shrink concurrently with the icosphere inflating. So I tried to approach it one way, which was using a shape key to turn the C into the icosphere, but as you can see, it didn't really work out. So I changed my approach, and instead of making the C turn into a sphere, I just decided to shrink the C a lot and inflate the sphere so that it encompasses where the C used to be. So to do that, basically just take the C, go to the very beginning of the animation, mark a keyframe where it's that size, go to near the end of the animation, mark the same keyframe so that it stays the same size, and then shrink it a lot at the very end. And so for this sphere, I'm going to do the inverse of that. So at the very beginning, have it be very small, but towards the end, I'm going to have it grow in size quite a bit. But just in case, I'm going to add in a keyframe for it to not be visible until that frame where it starts to grow larger. And you can do the same thing with making the carbon disappear after a certain frame. So I'm just going to continue to tweak the size of the sphere until it reaches a scale that I like. Replay the animation just to see how I like the timing of things. And I do have a little nitpick. I kind of want the growth of the sphere to have like a bouncy effect so that it's a lot more cartoonish and animated. So to do that, I'm going to select the last frames here where it changes its size particularly, and it'll show here in a second. But the last two so that it becomes a bounce after changing the first frames where it appears into an exponential. So select those last two frames, go to interpolation mode, select elastic, and just move that last frame over so that the size difference is a lot more exaggerated. So when you replay, it's a lot more like wow, 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 if that makes sense. Alright, so this is just basic styling of the scene. I'm choosing to use a similar color palette to how I styled my initial 2D animation, but of course, you can do whatever you want, do whatever makes you happy, whatever brings you joy in making these science animations, and also what is going to be pleasing to the eye. Just adjusting the C so it has a metallic look. I'm going to assign the same materials to all of the valence electrons here, which I also kind of want to be shiny pink, orange colored. So as soon as I set that first material, I'll just copy over that material to the other 3 icospheres. And as always, try to label everything as you go. I'm still trying to get better about that. It certainly helps out when you add a lot more elements to the same scene. So here I'm adjusting the camera. So making it so that at the very beginning of the animation it's very blurry and it's going to focus in on our object here, on our subject. So it gives it kind of like a little more cinematic feel. Here just rewatching it to see if I like how it pans out. And I'm pretty content with how this looks. I really like the bounce, and I do like how the camera pans in, focuses in on the sea at the very beginning. I'm also going to change the distance at which this lens focuses on, so I'm going to zoom in a little bit throughout the period of this animation so that the scene is a little more dynamic and it's not just you staring at moving valence electrons having nothing happening. At least there's going to be a little bit of additional movement with the camera without it being too busy. So at this point, I'm going to just not animate, I'm going to render one image and go over to the compositing node tab so that I can add in additional After Effects. So one that I've recently been digging is lens distortion, and I usually place that between 0.01 to 0.03. Any higher and you get like a kind of weird distorted effect, like a really unwanted distorted effect. And I'm gonna add in a glare and just finagle with those values until I get a nice kind of atmospheric look. Don't forget to change that final node and add it to the final composite node there. I've done that a few times and rendered entire animations where it didn't composite the way that I wanted it to, so I had to go back and re-animate everything. It's absolute pain. It's pain. Learn from my mistakes. Don't forget to add the last compositing node. Don't forget. Alright, moving on to the next section. After we let that last bit render, change the frames so that you're not working with the same time period as the first bit. So what you're going to do is add in a Bezier circle. First add in an array modifier so that it's at set count, and then add in a curve modifier and select the Bezier curve. And just do a little bit of finagling around with the X and Y axis and rotating the Bezier circle until you get the look of those spheres going around it in a circular fashion. And yeah, I'm not super intuitive with modifiers quite yet, so this did take me a little bit of time to mess around with until I got the end result that I was looking for. And this also depends on what axes you decide to arrange everything in. Here I'm just making sure that the Icosphere is centered at the very origin of our world here. Make sure that there are 6 individual spheres. I found out approximately what offset they need to be at in order for the spheres to be equidistant from each other. And you're going to want to add in a keyframe there. You can adjust the placement of that keyframe so that it's later on. Go back to the very beginning of that animation and set the offset to 0 so that you have an animation of the sphere going from 0 to that point. And we're in the final chapter, the 2D array. So it's basically just another couple of arrays, fine-tuning the distance between each of them so that they approximately mesh with each other. Selecting the merge option will make it so that the spheres kind of like, they kind of act like metaballs in the sense that they'll start to like intersect more freely. And when you're making graphene specifically, don't make the first initial mistake that I did, which was aligning the top sphere with the very bottom sphere. You're going to want an offset so that it gives the illusion that there is another row that is like shifted over a little bit so that you get like a cohesive tessellation. Yes, tessellation is the word. And you're going to want to animate that the exact same way that you did with the circular array, going to the very beginning of the animation, setting that offset to 0, then the very end where they're all positioned where you want them to be at that offset, and the very same exact steps for the second set of axes. And here I'm just rearranging where I want my camera to be so that it follows the movement of the carbon atoms over to the side and then down. So you're going to want to keyframe the respective axes changes. So if you're going on the x-axis, you're going to want to change the x-axis camera location. Same with the y and the z. And that's basically it. Just render everything from there, and you got yourself the first part of my thesis animation.